Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today we're so excited to highlight a portfolio company of one of our investors, the Heritage Group. Founded in 1930, the Heritage Group is a fourth-generation family-owned business managing a diverse portfolio of more than 30 companies, specializing in heavy construction materials, environmental services, and specialty chemicals. Like I said, they are an investor in Climeco. And with us today is Angela Price-Baker. Angela has a long history with the Heritage Group family of companies and currently serves as Director of Business Development for Envita Solutions. Envita is a premier supplier of customized waste and recycling programs, industrial services, and transformative sustainability solutions. Angela, we're really looking forward to learning from you about this topic. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, let's start with Envita Solutions. So tell us, what does Envita do? And if you want to add any background on the Heritage Group, that's also welcome, of course. But we're really curious to hear about Envita today.
Well, I'll start with who Envita is, and then I'll back it up into the Heritage Group portion and part of it. But basically, Envita Solutions is the service side of the Heritage Group. We focus on total byproduct management, meaning we look at everything the customer does operationally, logistically, and all the way from purchasing all the way down into what the disposal of is certain material. We do that for the purposes of bringing a consolidated program into scope, meaning we standardize billing, we standardize how waste is managed. We look at the suppliers to bring liability to the forefront to protect the brands, including our own. And we consolidate it into a managed approach program for the purposes of allowing our customers to become standardized as well as customized and optimized. So that's really the gist of that. I'm very proud. I've been doing it for a long time. I used to work in the operations side of it, so I'm very acclimated with how we do it. But to give you some background into how our company came to fruition, about back in 2000, we were actually in front of a customer who was looking for a new way to do things. They brought to our attention that they were looking for a one-stop shop for waste management. They didn't really feel like they had a good handle on how best to manage all the various suppliers they had in the background and do it from a top-down approach. And they challenged the Heritage team of companies to come up with a plan. And little did that company know that Heritage, being the inventors of a lot of things in the environmental sector, we were already starting to test pilot a program here in Indianapolis, and we brought that as a possibility, and we piloted it with them, and they are still our customer 23 plus years later. So we've continued to expand a tier one relationship with our customer base that services a lot of different industries. So,
super interesting.
Yeah.
So Envita recently rebranded from Heritage Interactive Services, now known as Envita Solutions. Tell us a little bit more about the rebrand and the drivers behind that.
Well, sure. So I'm sure nobody's at all surprised to know that the marketplace has changed over the last 5 to 10 years. It continues to evolve, and we're a part of that evolution inside of the Heritage Group. Heritage Interactive really was the pilot company that spurred off 20 plus years ago, and as recently as 2 years ago, we fell under a different portion of the Heritage Group, and we are solely independently owned inside the Heritage Group. They are our parent company, and we felt that it was time to bring a new name to that level of management, and it became from the environmental with Vita, meaning life. So we truly believe in the sustainability sector. We truly believe in not only bringing that to our customers, but living it as a brand, much the same as the Heritage Group, and that's been the focus for the last 2 years. And as of June 1st in 2023, we came full circle and we rebranded to Envita Solutions with the purpose of continuing to expand our model and grow it quite aggressively in the environmental sector because we truly believe we are the leader in that area, not only at Envita, but as the Heritage Group.
Well, and you mentioned the marketplace evolving and changing as it always does, right? But let's talk a little bit more about that. I know that's what listeners will be super interested to learn from you because you guys are and have been at the forefront of a lot of this. So let's talk about that. What are the main demands that you're seeing in the market?
Well, I mean, that's a broad question, but, it really focuses down into, you see a lot of acquisitions happening across the board, and you see a lot of companies working to consolidate spend. and they're looking to do it more efficiently. And we're no different. We're looking to bring that into the environmental sector. And the focus from customers has been to understand what they're doing from a transparency model at a higher level, but also bringing that standardized approach at the site level, because we understand that site locations and localized environment are very unique in their states and in their certain counties of each state. But at the corporate level, they want to understand what the sustainability targets are, how they're being met, how they're not being met. And it's to bring that standardized approach into that domain so that you have the transparency both at the site, corporate, and sustainability level. Where it's changing is that you have now their customers and the suppliers now heavily focused on sustainability metrics. There's a lot of obviously regulatory compliance that goes along with that, but customers as a whole are taking it much more seriously. They're looking to evolve and make sure that sustainability isn't just about recycling, but it's also about protecting their brand. It's also about making sure that they have those sustainability metrics in place and that they can show it to their customers in any number of ways. And, we talked, as recently as back in May about this, but you've got customers who are still very heavily focused on zero landfill and zero waste. And that requires customers to be looking very heavily into what's being purchased and also what's being disposed of. And that's one of the things we look a lot at inside of our programs. But then you have the carbon-free programs that are coming forward, and we truly believe that that's going to be a heavy focus, if not already a heavy focus inside many of our customer base. So we're working ahead not only in just on the ground, but even in our data and sustainability reporting to make sure that those kind of metrics can be reported and can be utilized inside of our customer base to continue to progress not only the customers, but their suppliers, because many of those suppliers are being requested and enforced to show that their sustainability programs are moving along in their progress of their own growth. So, it really is coming full circle inside of a corporate environment. And our program is sidelining with all those to make sure that those metrics can be measured. So.
And it's interesting. So, I think the zero waste to landfill has been a concept that's been around for probably longer than, say, a net zero emissions model. So do you see any conflict between those two, or do you have, some customers that, have a zero waste to landfill and they have a net zero? Are they seeing any friction between those?
There's absolutely friction between those. There are two different methodologies. You have Scope 3, which is going to be heavy in our domain, where you have and will be required to track carbon emissions and to see where your improvement over movement and logistics is meeting those metrics. And then you have, a smaller inventory of waste to energy facilities, which is the end of life at the end for zero landfill, which there are few and far between, which require creativity in moving materials. Obviously, we're doing that, but they still require a longer haul and a longer logistical movement of those goods. And so it does require deep diving inside of what should go to landfill and or waste to energy facilities, because logistically, we don't want to be tracking miles of air and or material that has a better use in the local domain. So when you compare those two arenas, we're looking at both, because obviously we don't want to logistically move material that shouldn't be moved. But at the same time, if you have a carbon reduction program, we have to be looking at companies like Climeco for carbon offsets, where we show reduction in materials to help offset some of those emissions that are going out and that will be tracked down the road in Scope 3. So there is a heavy conflict. It is also, from an administrative standpoint, different methodologies, and our customers are determining and evolving in what that looks like inside of their sustainability programs. And so they are kind of meeting in the middle, but they do go two very different directions. But we're working aggressively to, regardless of whichever domain those customers fall in, make sure that we're trying to work within both domains, so that depending if one carves out or the other carves out, we've got both covered. So
that's super interesting. It really is, right? So I think it kind of highlights sometimes the cost benefit and, competing objectives in our sustainability goals, right? And this is true of the whole, if you look at all the UN sustainable development goals, or SDGs, sometimes they're in competition with one another. So this is a really interesting example of that in the waste sector. And kind of at the end of the day, right? What is the ultimate goal? Which one is the most important? Where can we find that overlap where they work together? And then, how do you really prioritize at the end of the day what, say, level of environmental impact or type of environmental impact is really the one that is most pressing to mitigate? So very, very interesting. Do you have any? Go ahead. Sorry.
I think in our group, I think of the term competitive for sure, because they do compete with one another. But I think if companies start to look at them as complementing one another, I think that might be the better route for all of us to take. In reality, I think both seek out a good outcome. And if we can think of complementing them, then we can think about how to work together to logistically make sure that both objectives are being met. I don't think either one is right or wrong. I think that there's probably just the objective of our customer and their KPI metrics. And overall, I think a good methodology of mixing both is good for the environment, because it gets waste out of the system. And, I'll go back and clarify waste. Waste is anything. I used to call it S.W.E.A.T, solid water, energy, air, and toxins. Those are all objectives that inside of a program should be looked at. Because inside even our customers, if it's not something we service directly, we definitely work with them to look at all their components to make sure they're looking at it all consuming, as a program.
Can you say the S.W.E.T acronym again? What was it?
Sure. It's solids, water, energy, air, and toxins. Those are all things that contribute to waste. I mean, if there's noise in an environment from an air compressor leaking, it's obviously not contributing towards overall cost goals from, the energy component being wasted, and or noise can be a detraction from the employees who are working. So right, wrong, or indifferent, there's a lot of things that we need to look at inside of a program to make sure that they're operating at the optimized state. And that's where a program comes into place, which is change management.
So interesting. Well, let's talk. I know we won't get into names or anything of clients or relationships, but let's talk about some case studies, right? What are some examples of how the Envita model, it has really made an impact?
Well, we have several different customers, but one in particular, we have taken 23 plus facilities to zero landfill. And the biggest challenge that they had, and a lot of customers have, is filter cake. It depends on the constituents of it. It obviously depends on state regulatory EPA guidelines as to how it can be repurposed and or reused. And through working with them on how to haul it best to those limited numbers of waste to energy facilities, we did it cost effectively and managed to also take a large percentage of the volume of their waste, which was filter cake, into a localized environment and put it into a reuse that was agreeable to the customer, so that it wasn't moving that material over county and state lines to get it burned. We don't just look at there being a waste energy facility and determining that that's the best use for it. We look at it and go double deep and determine what material can be carved out of the program, what can be repurposed and not sent to a burner. And overall, that's why when you look at total tons of a customer, you'll have anywhere from 2 to 9% go to waste energy, but that's the target number, is to get it to 2, not to 9. Can material go there? Yes. Should it go there? Not necessarily. But with that said, also, customers are looking at cost. In today's environment, there is a cost to segregate material out. So we go with them and map out what is their starting point through a baseline and what is their finish point toward end of life, and make sure it's going to a facility that you can count on as far as liability goes, but making sure that if it has another purpose to it, you can take it to that from a cost savings perspective, because cost is always going to drive decision making. So, and other examples, I could go on and on.
No, please do. I think it's super interesting, and I think it's really helpful for our audience, who I would say is probably, as far as we know, mostly folks that work at corporations. They're corporate professionals or capital markets professionals trying to set up and implement these types of programs. So I think we'd love to hear another example.
Okay, I can give a couple more, actually.
That'd be great.
Years ago, personally, I worked on one where we had heavy grease on metal components of parts that go to a car. And they were being hauled from Mexico. And of course, the cost then to remove the oil or the grease, because grease on a car, steel attracts oxygen. Oxygen causes rust. Rust is a problem for metal. So they would put heavy grease on there to keep it shipping overseas. And then the facility who received them into the United States had to remove the heavy grease from that material. And it caused the wastewater treatment. It caused, obviously the wash water, all the costs were driven up. But it's still, when you looked at procurement, the cost to do it that way was better, right? Until we took a look at it and we started talking to our MRO suppliers, maintenance, repair, and operations suppliers. And we started to realize that they had other types of bags. And if you're in the automotive industry, you're familiar with those bags that prevent the oxygen from getting on the material. But this particular one had a copper lining on it that contributed to then the oxygen being drawn away from the metal, which the grease was there to protect. And it was wrapped from Mexico, and they got over a 6-figure savings just from looking at their purchasing habit and going to a simple bag that could then be turned around. And when you consolidate it, either whether it go to waste burn or landfill, was a much more cost-friendly solution. Plus, they didn't have the water expense. They didn't have the heavy grease and the cost associated with that. So the solution as a whole, when you looked at not just the facility and their operations, but what was creating this waste that was causing this burden, not just financially, but the burden of the operations itself, it's not just about cost. It's about what it costs to do all of it. And that's the total waste management perspective. They look at it the all-in price. And that's something we've been looking at for a long time, is what is the all-in price for this, part and piece of their operation. And so by just talking to our customers, getting to know the people on the ground, listening to their challenges, listening to the things that they, like human beings, don't like to do every day, there's an opportunity. And so we took it upon ourselves to take the challenges and solve for them. And so that is one thing that our program does. But on a lighter note, when you get into, and I worked in equipment for several years for Envita, but when you get into the just simple stuff, innovation does not have to be new and divine. It's sometimes just sharing practices that make logistical sense that today other companies and or sites are not practicing. And it's teaching them how to do it. And it's giving them that change management scope. And equipment is a perfect example of that. There are a variety of different solutions that come through equipment that bring those materials into a certain market segment that make them then marketable versus a waste. And when you get into then that carbon discussion, right, we want to move them efficiently down the road versus loose and or less desirable in the logistical market, so that the valuation or the value of the cost of not doing another practice become higher. And so we practice that oftentimes by looking at other ways to solve for material waste, listening to our customers, making sure that operationally that can be done, but we give them the information so they can begin to then, as I call it, put the roots in place for an ever-changing economy, an ever-changing world, so that when the world decides to change again, and it will, that they have the root system in place to be able to navigate it and be nimble in it.
Thank you. It's so helpful to hear kind of some of these really specific use cases and understanding why a total waste approach is can be so valuable to a company. Yeah. So, one other reflection I have is, before we wrap up, is that when you were talking about the total waste calculation in the automotive example, it sort of reminds me of the life cycle assessment when we look at a life cycle assessment of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because I think 100%. Yeah, it's sort of the similar concept of when you're looking with this laser sharp focus on one piece, it's easy to say like, well, yeah, of course this is lower emissions, or of course this is lower cost or whatever. But it's not till you take that holistic view of in LCA's cradle to grave, for example, or in this case, the total waste, that you really understand the full impact. And then once you have that type of information, then it's much, much clearer what it's repeatable, right? What that decision should be, right? What the business appropriate decision is, and of course the environmental appropriate.
Total waste maturity model. Yeah, it's the whole looking at the corporate down structure and seeing what can be done operationally and making sure that it's step down approach. Yeah, for sure.
Love it. So common sense, really, at the end of the day.
It is, but we're human. We love to do our thing.
Exactly. We like to overcomplicate it, right? Great. Yeah. Well, Angela, this has been such an interesting conversation. Do you have any other final thoughts before we wrap up on waste trends and where Envita is headed?
Well, Envita's growing. Envita's growing as the country right now, and honestly, the world is starting to figure out and ways to consolidate and scale down. Program like Envita is growing, and then that's another reason why it became imperative for us to carve ourselves apart and start to trend forward in a different direction as Envita Solutions. Is that our sector is growing in large part because there's a heavy focus on environmental sustainability right now because our world requires us to be better inside of the landscape that we're doing our business. And so we're growing, and we're working with customers to make sure they're growing alongside of us to come into the Heritage Group, where I'm going to throw the Heritage Group a plug because they are continually investing inside the environmental sector, bringing new types of innovations through obviously the venture group and other vehicles that provide solutions. And as you remember, 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of our solutions were heavily focused on overseas. And I think the information and technological era have kind of come back and collided a little bit. And I really have to give all the accolades to the Heritage family and to the group of companies for continuing to take on that challenge and bring the solutions into the arena that may not be a solution today, but they're continuing to look forward on those trends that bring value to the system as a environmental grouping of companies, and not just inside Heritage, but all the companies that are working to better the society of environment. So,
Angela, perfect way to end. I don't think I need to add anything. Thank you so much for sharing your time today.
100%. Thank you for having me.